Hi everyone, this is Ari Bee here with my Week 3 update on the Georgia legislative session. So I can't do this update without first taking a moment to commemorate the snow-mageddon that wasn't. The House and Senate can only meet for legislative day if both chambers meet on that day. So you can't have what is officially one of the 40 legislative days if the House meets but the Senate does not, or vice versa. So, when snow-mageddon threatened last Tuesday, the House decided to meet anyway and dragged the Senate into it. The result was that 0 senators showed up on Tuesday. They gavelled in and gavelled out, meaning the Secretary of the Senate showed up, announced it was time to convene, noted the lack of enough senators to conduct business, and declared the day over. You may not have heard of the Secretary of the Senate before, because this is not a position that is filled by an election. This is an administrative position, similar to the Clerk of the House, that helps the Senate keep track of bills and all of their daily business, as the Clerk of the House does for the House. Anyway, the Senate did not show up, but the Secretary of the Senate did. Meanwhile, the House took time to observe all the appropriate daily rituals, praying to Jesus with the pastor of the day, throwing shade at the Senate, congratulating some local Little League teams, and reading and assigning bills to committee. The Senate met for all of 16 seconds. The House met for about an hour. Now, towards the end of session, lawmakers will say, "We're a part-time legislature. We only have 40 days. We just can't do everything in 40 days." In response to questions about why certain bills or issues never got addressed. Keep days like Tuesday in mind when you hear these sorts of claims, because it is some evasive BS. I'm not saying that the 16 Senates the House met for, or the hour the Senate spent on what amounts to rudimentary chores, reflect laziness or incompetence on the part of either chamber. That's not what I'm saying. We're at the start of a 2-year cycle, so there's been a lot of necessary behind-the-scenes organizing happening over the past couple of weeks. Committees and caucuses have to get organized, appoint officers, adopt rules before they can get down to business. So what I am saying is that the folks in power have a lot of control over what happens. And we saw that on Tuesday to a pretty extreme degree when the Senate met for a legislative day, but not a single senator showed up. And as I said, they literally gavelled in and gavelled out. And to a much lesser extent, we'll continue to see days where you question how productive they are during the first half of the legislative session. So days like last Tuesday are a reminder that the legislature does exactly what it wants, both with its time and with regards to what bills get passed, let alone get a committee hearing. This whole not enough time excuse just doesn't fly with me. Anyway, let's move on to things that did happen last week. The House Democratic Caucus held a meeting of voting rights advocates and various voting machine vendors. Those vendors are vying for the $150 million in Kemp's proposed budget for the state to purchase new voting machines. Sarah Riggs Amico presented on anomalies in voting data, particularly in her race for lieutenant governor. She's claiming there's a significant amount of voter drop-off above what's normal for past elections in Georgia. Voter drop-off is the normally occurring trend of lower voter participation the farther down the ballot you go. Most voters are going to vote for governor or whatever position is the top of the ticket. But by the time you get to the local soil and water conservation district supervisor, not nearly as many voters choose someone. According to Amico, the drop-off in her particular race, the race for lieutenant governor, is much greater than it normally has been or should be. Voter drop-off is also more noticeable in Democratic-leaning counties and among folks who voted electronically, either by voting early in person or by voting on Election Day. Again, this is according to the data that Sarah Riggs Amico presented. Currently, absentee ballots are the only paper ballots used in Georgia. When the data was broken down by method of voting, this method, absentee paper ballots, did not show this unusually large drop-off in voters. However, the large drop-off was prevalent for votes collected from voting machines, both from early in-person voting and voting on Election Day. I'll post a link to Sarah Riggs-Amico's data from the last election, plus a link to her presenting this information to the committee. Dr. Richard DeMillo from Georgia Tech and Sarah Henderson of Common Cause also spoke at that meeting. Both shared concerns that investing in the latest and greatest in voting technology will not restore the public's trust in Georgia's voting systems. There are also concerns that continuing to rely on a completely computer-based system will continue to make Georgia's voting technology susceptible to hacking, viruses, malware, or other sources of interference. A large group of voting rights advocates were in attendance, with many wearing shirts and stickers in support of hand-marked paper ballots. Think the Scantron sheets you filled out if you ever took a standardized test in school, and not the hanging chad debacle of Florida circa 2000. Some of the arguments in favor of paper ballots are: a voter can confirm that a paper ballot correctly recorded their vote. Paper ballots create an auditable paper trail if election results are ever called into question. There will literally be paper records of every vote that was cast. That can be audited. Paper ballots reduce concerns about hacking or lack of transparency, and paper ballots, plus the optical scanners needed to read them, would cost about $30 million instead of $150 million. I'm not sure how much traction this discussion will gain among Republicans, who largely view the last election as being fair. Yes, when you talk to conservatives in the Capitol, the consensus I've at least gotten so far is that claims of voter suppression, that voter purges were done illegally, that voters were in other ways denied access to the voting process are overblown, and that for the most part, Georgia's election was fair, and the results reflect a fair and honest election. I'm also curious to see how discussions around accessibility, particularly for folks with disabilities, will play into this discussion of having a literal hand-marked paper ballot. There's some discussion about using a hybrid system, and that might give the state more flexibility to create options that, for instance, a voter who is visually impaired or has some mobility limitations can still cast a vote and still cast a paper ballot, but it'll be done via a machine that then prints out the vote. So this is a discussion I want to follow to the extent that it actually gets picked up and happens in the larger General Assembly. It's unclear at this point what other voting issues might get addressed, for better or for worse. This includes issues like gerrymandering, voter purges, early voting periods, exact match voter ID laws, and the like. The other big news from the past week: Georgia, of all states, may become the 38th state to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. You may recall during the first week of the legislative session, the women of the Senate spoke out against their lack of representation in positions of power within the Senate. In some ways, this is an extension of that bipartisan concern. In some ways, this is an issue that Democrats at least have taken up in the past and predates this particular political moment. If Georgia adopts the ERA, it would be the 38th state to do so, as I said, and theoretically cause it to become an official part of the U.S. Constitution. The support of 38 states, that's 3/4 of state legislatures, is needed to ratify an amendment to the Constitution. There are several legal questions that would have to be worked out, but it is an interesting thought that Georgia could become the state that codifies sex-based equal rights into the U.S. Constitution, or at least facilitates this happening by being the final state to give its approval. The specific language of the ERA is very short. Equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It's unclear how the adoption of the ERA would affect transgender folks like myself, as the language is based on sex and not gender, gender identity, or gender presentation. There have been some legal cases that concluded in favor of trans folks based on laws or policies that protect people from discrimination on the basis of sex. But the U.S. Constitution is next level, and the issue would likely end up getting decided by the Supreme Court, by our current Supreme Court, that is. I'll post links both to an FAQ in support of the ERA and a takedown of the challenges this constitutional amendment would face. So far, there haven't been any bills introduced relating to some of the top platforms of conservatives: immigrants, immigration, and abortion. I also have not seen anything major yet around criminal justice, either reforms or policies that would lead to the incarceration of more people. Guns did slip in on the last day of session last week with the introduction of constitutional carry, aka permitless carry. You can get more information on that from my post about day 7. I'll make sure to post a link to that as well below. Meanwhile, Democrats have introduced legislation to increase the minimum wage to $15, expand Medicaid, create private breastfeeding or pumping spaces at the Capitol, create an independent redistricting commission, and expand access to Hope tuition grants to older adults. Don't expect these bills to go far, but it's nice to see Dems trying. Now that the Super Bowl has passed and the basics have been taken care of, expect things to start picking up. Post any questions or comments below. I'd love to answer them, or if I can't, find somebody who can. And that's all I have for y'all this week. Bye!